My name is Adalberto Sousa, but most people around here just call me Berto. I've worked on the farm since I can remember, just like my father and grandfather did. The property where we live is near a tiny village, lost in the depths of Sertão Pedregoso. It is a place with hard land and a dry climate, but it has always served to provide our livelihood. But one year, a plague of birds took over our corn plantation. The birds pecked at the still green cobs before they were even ready for harvest. My father, Cecilio, a man of great experience, quickly said, "Let's put up a scarecrow, Berto. That's the only way to get those pests to leave the cornfield." We grabbed a handful of old clothes and an abandoned straw hat and put together the body of the puppet. My younger brother, Anselmo, wanted to draw a face on the cloth we used as the head. He grabbed a charcoal stick and made two big eyes, a crooked nose, and a mouth that curved upwards, looking like a weird smile. We thought it was funny at the time, but we didn't care much. The goal was just to scare the birds away. We placed the creature right in the middle of the field. It stood tall, clumsy, with its arms open as if it wanted to embrace the wind. Anselmo even gave it a name, Nestor, the scarecrow. On the first day, nothing unusual happened. The birds moved away and even seemed a little suspicious. At night, everything was calm. But when I woke up the next morning and went to look at the cornfield, I felt that something was out of place. The scarecrow seemed slightly changed. The right arm, which had previously hung down, was now slightly raised as if pointing to the sky. I wondered if it might have been the early morning wind, so I let it go. The next morning I noticed another change. Nestor's trunk, which used to be straight, seemed to be crooked to one side, as if it were turning toward the dirt path that leads to our house. I asked Anselmo, "Have you been moving the scarecrow?" He swore he hadn't. I continued tending to the crops, but the story kept playing in my head. Every morning, the same story. The scarecrow would appear in a different way, as if it had taken a step or turned its face to look at someone passing by. Every time I looked at it, I felt a chill on the back of my neck. I tried to ignore it, but deep down, it started to scare me. One night, I decided to stand guard to see if I could find out who or what was moving the scarecrow. I waited for everyone to go to sleep and went into the fields, carrying a machete to feel safer. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the full moon illuminated everything with a soft light. The wind blew slowly, swaying the corn leaves. I stood there behind a clump of grass, looking in the direction of the scarecrow. After a long time without seeing anything, a strange sensation of movement began. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but my heart raced when I had the clear sensation that the scarecrow had raised itself a little. It seemed to be breathing. Overcome with terror, I continued to look without blinking until its head turned millimeters as if it were looking for something around. At that moment, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine because its charcoal eyes, previously crudely drawn, seemed sunken, almost alive. I didn't have the courage to move. The silence was broken by a slight rustling, but there was no strong wind, nothing that could justify that noise. Then the scarecrow tilted its neck to the side as if it had noticed my presence. My reaction was impulsive. I took off running. I ran so fast that the leaves of the cornfield scratched my legs, and the twisted branches of the trees looked like hands trying to grab me. The machete slipped from my sweaty hand, but I didn't go back to pick it up. I embraced the flickering light of the lantern on the porch of my house and stood there, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding. I looked again, hoping to see the scarecrow in the same place, motionless. Only now he was with his arms open, facing exactly where I was, as if he was staring at me in the dark. I was sure that when I ran, his back was to me. I entered the house without any fuss and locked myself in my room. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cloth smile. The next day, my mother noticed my frightened expression. "You look pale, Berto. You look like you've seen a ghost." I simply replied that I hadn't slept well. My father and Anselmo left early for the fields, and I stayed to help with the chores around the house. Every now and then, I would look out the window. There was the scarecrow standing tall, mute, with that grotesque painting smiling. As the sun began to set on the horizon, I gathered my courage. I grabbed another machete and headed toward the cornfield. The orange light of the late afternoon left the scarecrow full of elongated shadows. I got closer and noticed that the cloth head had wrinkles that weren't there before. They looked like creases that gave different expressions, almost like a living face. The crooked smile had grown wider, staring at me with a certain scorn. I reached out to touch him. The cloth was warm, even without such strong sunlight that day. I pulled my hand away at the same moment. What a strange thing. It was then that I detected a bad odor. A mixture of damp earth, as if it were muddy, mixed with the smell of sun-dried meat. My stomach churned and I ran back, dropping the machete on the ground. That night I realized that this could not go on. I waited for everyone to fall asleep and grabbed a lantern. I had to put an end to Nestor the scarecrow. I walked the same path as before, this time with determination. However, as I approached the center of the cornfield, the atmosphere seemed heavy, without a breeze, with a chilling silence. I saw the silhouette of the scarecrow against the night. The smell was stronger than ever, as if something was really rotting in that place. I raised the machete to cut the whole thing down, but the lamp went out. I was left in total darkness, my heart racing and sweat running down my face. I tried to strike a match, and it was in that flickering glow that I saw the worst. Nestor was no longer stuck to the post. He was sitting on the floor, his legs bent unnaturally, his head lolling to the side, but he was staring at me. The match burned my finger and I fell backwards. Before I could run away, something grabbed my arm. Its touch was rough, like a mixture of cloth and dry twigs. I tried to pull away, but that improvised hand was strong. As my vision began to adjust to the darkness, I could see better. The fingers were sewn together with thick string, as if someone had tried to give human form to something that shouldn't move, but did. The rotten smell was unbearable. I pulled with all my strength, but the scarecrow tilted its face, studying me without letting go of my wrist. A cold terror took hold of me. I tried to pray. That's when I heard a low, hoarse laugh coming from inside the cloth. I miraculously freed myself, kicking the doll and running across the dark field. The machete lay there, abandoned. I arrived home panting, locked the door and lay in bed, waiting for the worst. Nothing came. At dawn, I returned, almost without strength. And there was the scarecrow, back on the post, intact, as if nothing had happened. But now the drawn smile seemed to stretch almost to the cloth ears, a mocking laugh. The following days became even stranger. Anselmo started waking up in the middle of the night, swearing he heard a voice calling his name. My mother dismissed it as a nightmare. I knew it wasn't. The night wind whispered unintelligible words, always coming from that part of the cornfield where the scarecrow was. Our dog disappeared without a trace. My father thought he had run after an animal, but I suspected something darker was going on. I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to put an end to this. I waited until nightfall, grabbed a gallon of kerosene, and went back to the field. The lantern swayed in my hand, casting flickering shadows. Even from a distance, the scarecrow looked hunched over, with deep-set coal eyes. Something in my head screamed that I shouldn't do this, but I ignored the warning. I poured kerosene all over the cloth and set it on fire. The flames rose quickly, licking the straw and fabric. The smell that spread was not just of burning cloth, but of flesh. That's when the doll moved. He spread his arms wide, as if to free himself from the fire, and screamed. It was not a human sound, but something hoarse, guttural, from an ancient and living nightmare. I ran away as the flames grew, illuminating that face with an expression of hatred. When my father woke up, he only found ashes. Anselmo no longer had nightmares, the planting recovered, and the birds no longer destroyed our ears of corn. But even today, when the wind blows hard in the early morning, I swear I still hear a muffled laugh echoing through the leaves. I don't usually talk about it, not for fear of disbelief, but because some things don't deserve to be remembered. The more we tell them, the more they seem to come back. Even so, there are stories that cannot be buried with us alone. And there's another one that I remember now, the so-called Comitiva da Madrugada. The first time I heard about her was when I went to work on Mr. Fortunato's farm. The property was old, huge, and they said that a lot of dark things happened there. I went because I needed to earn a living, and a cousin of mine, Tullio, was already working there as a laborer. He assured me that, despite the demanding work, the payment was worth it. The place was isolated, surrounded by woods, with the farm hands' houses lined up near the corral. The horses were kept in a large enclosure, and beyond that were fields where the cattle grazed at night. I spent the first month without any strange occurrences, just the scorching sun and the long working hours. But one day, after a nighttime storm, the pasture got soaked, and we went early to check if any cows had gotten stuck. We were walking through the mud when Tullio stopped and pointed to something on the ground. Marks of horseshoes, lots of them, as if it were an entire herd of horses. But there were no traces of people, nor footprints of anyone who could have led those animals. Tullio made a strange face. "This again?" I asked. "What do you mean, again?" He remained silent, shook his head and moved on. I didn't understand, but I didn't insist. That night, the entire farm was asleep when the sound of cavalry woke me up. It sounded like a herd of cattle was crossing the yard, the sound of hooves echoing. I got up and went to look out the window. The moon was big, illuminating the pasture. I could see a line of horses trotting along silently, as if they were being led by cowboys. Only there was no one visible, until I noticed shadows over the saddles. They were men with wide hats, dark clothes that did not flutter in the wind. They held the reins, but they didn't move. The visual impact was enormous. I got goosebumps all over. And suddenly one of them turned his face. There were no features, it was all dark, a void where the eyes and mouth should be. I closed the curtain, feeling my heart want to jump out of my mouth. The worst came next. Amidst the noise of the hooves, I heard a drawn-out voice. "Come on, cowboy. What are you waiting for?" It seemed to be both outside and inside my head. I was petrified, unable to breathe. The voice repeated, "Come on, cowboy. What are you waiting for?" I crossed myself silently, hoping that it would pass soon. After a few minutes, the hazing dissipated and silence returned. The next day, I was standing in the courtyard with a sullen face before sunrise. Tullio appeared, looked at me and said, "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, and he sighed. "That's right. Now be careful." I asked him what to be careful of, but he didn't explain. He just said that I shouldn't hear that call again. The atmosphere on the farm became strange. The older farm hands avoided the subject, and Mr. Fortunato himself didn't like it when people mentioned horse tracks that appeared in the mud for no reason. Later, when I returned to the pasture, I saw the tracks again, but this time there were bare human footprints next to the horseshoes, which disappeared abruptly. I froze. Tullio even grabbed me by the shoulder. "Get out of there, Berto. Don't get involved." But I was already involved. Every night the sound of hooves would come, bringing that smell of wet earth without rain. I tried to go to bed early, but I couldn't resist the temptation to look through the crack in the window. On the third night, a cold wind blew and I heard that growing trot again. I got up, my heart racing, and went to the door. Tullio, who was sleeping in the same room, whispered, "Don't go out." I ignored it. I had to see. I pulled back the curtain, and there was the entourage once again. This time I could see their clothes were torn, as if they were old, some of them made of worn leather. But the worst part was their faces. Where their eyes should have been, there were deep holes, and some of their mouths were sewn shut as if a rough thread ran through their skin. A shiver ran through me when one of them turned his hat around and stared at me. I felt the same voice in my mind. "Come on, cowboy. Get on. We're waiting for you." My legs almost gave out. I took a step back, bumping into the bed, and Tulio caught me. He murmured, "I told you not to look." When I pulled myself together and looked out the window again, the procession had disappeared, dissolving into the night as if it had never been there. But I knew I would be called again. The third night was decisive. The next day dragged on. It seemed like the sun was watching me, judging my steps. It got late in the afternoon and I was overcome with fear. I knew that night would bring something definitive. When it got dark, a strange force pulled me out as if there was no option. I had to face it. I walked to the pasture. The wind howled differently, and the trot grew louder. I felt the ground shake. The procession emerged from the undergrowth, the shadows moving slowly, each rider displaying the same macabre, empty expression. My body froze, and the voice rang out, "Come, cowboy." The hollow eyes seemed to devour me, and at that moment, something inside me wanted to accept the call, mount up and ride forever into the night, as if it were my destiny. I could neither speak nor run away. In their midst, a larger figure appeared with an air of leadership. He did not have empty eyes like the others, but a sinister, almost human countenance. He signaled for me to join them. Before I could understand what was happening, the troop galloped off, disappearing into the darkness at an impossible speed. The sound of the hooves, however, continued inside my head. In those seconds, I felt that I would never be the same again. In the following days, everything returned to a semblance of normality, but I knew they were still around. Sleeping was never the same again. Every now and then, in the deepest silence of the night, I feel as if the entourage is watching over me. It was about 3 in the morning and I couldn't sleep. The silence was suffocating, so heavy that not even the insects spoke. At one point I heard a shrill scream coming from some distant corner of the pasture. It seemed to be coming from an area that no one used anymore, near a pet cemetery that had been in disuse for years. The dogs began to bark like crazy, but the rest of the cattle remained in an eerie silence. I went to the window and saw a faint light, like a candle flame, dancing in the great distance. Heart raced. I remembered the stories about the former owner of those lands, Mr. Raimundo, who had died a violent death. Some said he was stabbed in a fight, others that he mysteriously disappeared. Either way, the farm was never the same after that. The scream sounded again, even closer, and my entire body shivered. They said that Raimundo's spirit still wandered there, unable to rest, perhaps in search of some kind of revenge. The wind did not rise, nothing moved, but the lamentation continued. I was torn between investigating or running back to bed. In the end, a strange curiosity, or stubbornness, spoke louder. I grabbed a flashlight and an old shotgun just in case. The night seemed darker than usual. Every step seemed to lead nowhere, as the farm was huge, full of forgotten corners. As he advanced, a smell of damp earth spread, even though not a drop of rain had fallen. The scream was mixed with a moaning sound, something I couldn't describe as animal or human. Then I saw a figure near an abandoned fence. It was leaning on the wires as if it were observing the horizon. I tried to focus the flashlight, but the light failed. For a brief moment, that silhouette turned to me. It was not a solid figure. It looked like a shadow of a person, but shapeless. A chill ran up my neck. Then the figure dissolved, disappearing slowly. The scream now sounded like a lament, almost a cry for help. My breath became shallow, my heart raced, and I continued on to the pet cemetery, even though I was terrified. They say that's where the old farmer's body was buried. As I got closer, the ground became softer, smelling of rot, as if something had been buried there for a long time. I felt a presence watching me, an invisible pressure that made me almost give up. But still, I walked towards the rotting wooden fences. I felt a warm sensation and suddenly saw a scene in my mind, as if it were a nightmare. Mr. Raimundo, covered in dirt, with hateful eyes and skeletal hands, advancing towards me. Each step left a trail in the mud, as if he were crawling out of the grave. His hands reached out, trying to hold me, and I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. Then I heard another voice, weak and hoarse. "You're the last one. You'll have to pay." It was as if it echoed not only in my ears, but inside my head. I stood, paralyzed. The earth seemed to hold me by the feet. Suddenly, everything disappeared. The air became light. The wind returned. The presence disappeared, leaving only a heartbreaking silence. When I regained my mobility, I ran home, almost without knowing how I got there. I rummaged through my old belongings and found an old notebook with notes about the farm. There were passages that mentioned the death of Mr. Raimundo and said that he swore revenge on whoever tried to take possession of the land unfairly. I could tell that the apparition was not going to disappear anytime soon. He would be trapped there, crying out for answers about his own death, while haunting anyone who got too close. It was a muggy November day when my uncle, Romulo, who worked as a laborer on another farm in the Serra Comprida region, called me to see an old house, which he said gave shivers to anyone who passed by. The building had been sold more than 40 years ago, but the sinister stories never stopped. The house was in disrepair, with peeling paint and crumbling windows. We went there on a Saturday morning because my uncle swore that something was very strange. As soon as we arrived, the first sensation was of heavy air. It wasn't just the old age of the house. It was as if a cloud of bad energy hung over everything. It seemed that even the birds avoided the place. My uncle told me that the previous owner, Seu Casimiro, had died many years ago, but his presence still haunted the walls. People who had lived there spoke of a figure wandering the hallways, appearing at the bedroom doors as if giving orders. When I looked at the end of the property, I saw the main house, made of stone, dark, almost sucking in the sunlight. The silence was deafening, so much so that I could hear my heartbeat. My uncle was direct. "Let's go in. Don't be afraid of what you'll see. The house doesn't bite, but who lives in it? I can't guarantee that." The little gate creaked as we passed. The wind shook the trees, but curiously, it did not cool the environment. As soon as we walked through the front door, I felt a cold breeze. It was as if something there was blocking the daylight. The smell of old wood and mold seemed to permeate every brick. The walls were covered in worn wallpaper, almost falling apart. Some old furniture remained in the same place, as if waiting for its owner to return. My uncle pointed to the stairs leading to the second floor and then to a door at the end of the hallway. "That's where he appears. If you don't like something, you make a point of showing that you still own it." Near that door, I noticed an old rocking chair. It was moving very slowly on its own, without enough wind to rock it. I tried to keep my composure, but it was hard not to get goosebumps from this sight. My uncle put a finger to his lips, asking for silence. He went to the chair and stood in front of it. "There's no point in trying to understand. Old Casimiro won't leave here because he has something unfinished." Before I could ask any more questions, the chair stopped rocking. A shiver ran through me. It was as if the house had noticed our presence. I felt a pressure in my head, a growing discomfort. "Let's go up," my uncle said, wanting to distract me. "Things are even stranger up there." The stairs creaked beneath our feet, each step echoing eerily. On the second floor, the feeling of being watched intensified. The bedroom doors were closed, some with visible scratches on the wood, as if something or someone had tried to get out. The smell of damp earth was almost unbearable. It was then that out of nowhere, one of the doors opened by itself. The creaking sound was so loud that my heart raced. My uncle just gave me a serious look, as if he already knew that routine of inexplicable events. "This is where he usually shows up," he whispered. The room was dark, and as soon as we entered, the door closed behind us. The silence was total, not a breath of wind, nothing. It seemed like we were trapped in a space outside of time where only the oppression of that house existed. My uncle lit a candle he had brought with him. The flickering light revealed walls with marks that looked like deep scratches. The place was filled with a mold that seeped into the nostrils and left a bitter taste in the mouth. He pointed to a dark wooden chair carved all over that looked like an ancient relic. It had carvings of twisted flowers, and the upholstery, although worn, showed elaborate lines. Something about the piece of furniture gave me the chills, as if it were a sentinel. Suddenly the chair shook slightly, almost imperceptibly. The candle went out, as if the air had suddenly become dense. I was left in total darkness, hearing only the sound of my heart. Then I saw, or felt, a figure in the corner of the room. It was like a patch of smoke, floating. It had the shape of a man, but it moved without stepping on the floor. Its eyes seemed fixed on me, and its mouth opened in murmurs that I did not understand. My uncle stood there, unmoved, as if he had become accustomed to it. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. It was as if I were trapped in a waking nightmare. The figure approached, just a few steps away from us. Then he gestured with his hand, pointing toward a dark corner. Suddenly, another sound filled the house, a low, muffled cry that seemed to come from the walls. My uncle, with an emotionless voice, simply commented, "This is old Casimiro. He won't go away." Then, in a flash, the presence disappeared, as if sucked into the air. The candle, mysteriously, relit with the light breeze that blew afterwards. I was dizzy, trying to understand what had just happened. When we left the house, night had already fallen, and the moon illuminated the courtyard. The relief of being out didn't take away my fear. My uncle just said, "He's still in charge here, even after he's dead." There are many stories of ghosts circulating in these lands. There are always people telling stories, visions, voices, shadows. And the most amazing thing is that most people see and hear the same thing. I myself have never been able to step foot in a cornfield after 7 at night without feeling a cold sweat running down my face. Years ago, when Mr. Nicanor bought old Benicio's land, they said that there had been strange phenomena there since the death of the previous owner. They claimed that old Benicio would wander around at night, watching over the crops. After his death, the employees began to report strange sounds in the cornfield. I remember well the second season I worked there. It was almost 3 in the morning and I was taking care of the cattle when Fuzue, my pet dog, started barking desperately. I looked at the cornfield, but everything was dark. Only the wind was too strong. My first idea was, it could be some big animal. I followed Fuzue to the rows of corn and noticed several ears of corn had fallen over, as if someone had pulled them out with great force. I became restless. It wasn't normal. And then I heard footsteps running between the branches, but I saw no one. The noise came from a specific point, then disappeared. Fuzue suddenly went quiet, as if he had also felt something very strange. I went back to the accommodation that night, but I didn't sleep a wink. I told the story in the morning, and people laughed, saying I must be imagining things. But in the following weeks, the situation worsened. Every now and then you could hear footsteps running through the corn, and not a single soul could be seen. The ears of corn appeared torn to shreds, with no sign of any plague. One of the bravest was Antenor, a farmhand for over 30 years. He decided to go there and investigate. He came back pale, trembling. He remained silent for a long time until he spoke. That is not from God. And he refused to say what he had witnessed. Since then, every time someone tried to approach the cornfield at night, there would be an even worse noise, accompanied by screams. not exactly human, but sounding like a creature in agony. Those screams made the blood run cold. One time I went with my colleague Olavio, determined to find out. We bet it was a jaguar or a wild animal. We entered, shining a flashlight. Soon scratches appeared, as if huge claws were scraping the corn stalks, and a heavy breathing, almost a threatening snore echoed. The tension was so great that we braked. Then we heard laughter. It wasn't human sound. It sounded like a distorted, mocking laugh. In an instant, I saw a large, hunched shape moving among the leaves, with long, gnarled legs and eyes that reflected a sickly light. Olavio, without saying anything, grabbed my arm and we shot back. After that, no one wanted to go near the cornfield at night. The ears of corn continued to fall and the screams intensified. The atmosphere became so bad that many people resigned. Nikonor's family also began to say that they felt something strange even inside the house, as if someone was spying on them. In a short time, they sold everything and disappeared. Finally, I remember a case of the pecky tree on Mr. Dionisio's farm. This tree was in the middle of sparse grass next to a small road and had a cross carved into its trunk. No one knew who had carved it. The story that was circulating was that the cross had been made by a man who died without a wake, without a grave, without anything. The person who told me was Donna Romilda, Mr. Dionisio's wife. She said that whenever she passed by that pecky tree, she felt a shiver, as if a cold hand had touched her. She said that, a long time ago, a man named Amarildo lived on the farm, a lonely man who spoke little. He had appeared there without warning, and few knew where he came from or what he really did. One day, Amarildo disappeared. He gave no explanation. He simply disappeared. A few days passed, and a cowboy, Barto, saw him near the pecky tree, but he had a lost look in his eyes, as if he were in a trance. Barto approached, and Amarildo murmured, "Now the cross is marked." It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Amarildo's body was found shortly afterwards, lying at the foot of that tree with no apparent injuries. He had a tormented expression, as if his last moments had been one of intense suffering. No one dared to bury the man. It seemed as if the earth had swallowed him without ceremony. After that, anyone passing by swore they heard moans, whispers, and even muffled screams, as if a voice was calling for help. Many believed it was Amarildo's soul, trapped in the trunk by the poorly made cross, unable to find rest. On moonless nights, they said that the mark on the tree moved, pulsating, and anyone who stayed there too long felt a pressure in their chest, as if something was sucking the air. I, curious, one day decided to go there, just with a flashlight and courage. As soon as I arrived, I noticed that the air around the pecky was cold, despite the heat in the region. The cross was marked with deep machete cuts, and I had the distinct feeling of being watched. The wind blew a cold gust, and I heard a sigh. I looked back. Nothing. When I looked back at the trunk, I saw a crouching figure, short and hunched, almost stuck to the bark of the tree, as if it had come from inside it. The rotten smell hit me. A moan grew louder, sounding like agony. I tried to back away, but I stumbled, feeling suffocated, as if invisible hands were grabbing me by the neck. Then I heard a piercing scream, and, on impulse, I looked. I saw a deformed face with whitened eyes and a mouth wide open without sound. It seemed to want to swallow me. I was paralyzed, but in a lapse of consciousness, I threw myself backwards and fainted. I woke up at home without knowing how I had gotten there. Since then, I have never set foot near that pecky tree again, and everyone in the region avoids going there, especially at dawn. They say that Amarildo's spirit wanders without peace, chained to the carved cross. Until this soul is freed, the place remains cursed, attracting things that do not belong to our world. If you watched these reports until the end, here's a warning. The backlands have mysteries that we cannot explain. There are forces that manifest themselves in forgotten places, taking the form of figures, whispers, and legends that span generations. And now, a special request. Like this video, comment on what you thought of these stories, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. If you've watched this far, comment with a ghost emoji, so I know you stayed until the end and are brave enough to face these hidden mysteries. Want to go further? Become a member of the channel and get access to exclusive benefits, including never-before-seen content about the scariest and most secret stories from distant lands. But remember, once you delve into stories like these, there is no guarantee that you will come out unscathed. The unknown has its traps, and only those who face fear head-on will understand the secrets it holds. Get ready, because the backlands are still alive with secrets, and when the wind blows hard at night, maybe it's not just the wind.